The dawn of the 19th century saw South Carolina on the eve of a period of great economic power and wealth, brought about by lowland rice on coastal plantations, and, thanks to Eli Whitney's cotton gin, short staple cotton in upland or Piedmont, South Carolina. Great plantations and small farms spread throughout the river and creek-fed hollows and valleys of the Piedmont of South Carolina. With this expansion came a population that needed utilitarian stonewares. In kitchens from log cabins to great houses, there was a need for crocks, for pitchers, churns, even liquor jugs. The first potter to meet this need was a physician named Landrum, who began a pottery near Edgefield, South Carolina. He started to produce stoneware which was not uncommon in South Carolina, but what was unique was his glazes. Called an alkaline glaze, it produced wonderfully brilliant, rich colors from bright yellows to dark greens. Other potters followed Landrum, and soon pottery industries began to spread throughout South Carolina to North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and even as far as Texas. By the end of the 19th century, glass, plastic, and metal supplanted the need for utilitarian stonewares. The potteries disappeared, and the sites on which they were made became overgrown and began to vanish. In this program, you're going to meet the potters, speaking to you through the mute beauty of the wonderful wares they produced, and from the sites where they once worked. You'll also meet some of the avocational historians and avocational archaeologists who little more than 30 years ago began to realize that this wonderful folk art tradition was worth saving. These are the people who realized that this wonderful combination of earth, fire, and water in the hands of artisan potters had in fact created a tradition of folk art that was worth preserving. These are the people who have saved for us a heritage in clay. The Holcomb family of Clinton, South Carolina, began to document the state's folk pottery traditions. Their efforts were sparked by this handsome pitcher, which was discovered during a Charleston dig. When they realized the rarity of the find, Dr. Holcomb went to the University of South Carolina.
We were in the late 60s and early 70s doing research in tangible history in the backyards of Charleston. And this particular picture came from a site in Charleston, and we were unable at that time to determine just the type of material. We've been finding all types of English ceramics and European ceramics, some American ceramics, Moravian ceramics, some of early Bartlam things, we think. And when we started finding this type of stoneware glaze, we became quite interested in trying to determine where it came from. And finally, after much research, we realized that we had stumbled onto a South Carolina gem, that the wares that we were finding, sherds in Charleston, were actually made in the upper part of South Carolina in the Edgefield district. And at that time we decided that we would try to make a survey of the pottery sites in the Edgefield district, which we did, and from there we made a survey of the other pottery sites in the state, Columbia, the jug towns of upper South Carolina, the pottery site in Lawrence County, South Carolina, the Johnson pottery site. And after we had all of this research in our minds, and we realized that a tradition was still intact. And my wife and I, we paid a visit to the Department of Archaeology and at the University of South Carolina, and I think it was in 1973. to explain to them the extent of our research and to see if we could encourage them to do further research in trying to preserve this tradition.
The Holcombs were convinced that a great deal of information could be saved by collecting vessels and then by archaeologically excavating pottery sites. Historian Joe Holcomb explains how the archaeology helped to identify collected vessels. Now, Joe, what we have here is the LM picture that you found with your father in Charleston, and the one that started the Holcomb collection, essentially.
Yes, it did.
Since then, you've excavated a great number of sites and recovered a lot of material archaeologically. Show me, if you can, what the importance of those archaeological sherds are in terms of identifying and putting a label on pieces like this that you might not have known about before.
Well, as I sit here looking at this table, I'm thinking these sherds represent at least 25 years of excavations of probably, I would say, 25 to 30 sites throughout the state. And the importance of fragments like this, in the absence of any piece that's not signed or marked like this, which is noticeably inscribed LM for Lewis Miles, in the absence of any signature or mark, you have to have some way of giving a pedigree to pieces. And that really began our journey. This piece is a prime example of linking a specific potter to a certain site. This piece and others like it, showing noticeable throwing ridges on the vessel, were dug on a previously unrecorded site by us and our research associates on Horse Creek in Edgefield District. And we were able to say that Dave, and we think that Dave was at this specific location due to the presence of throwing ridges, due to the fact that they are on this vessel in size LM.
Can we show that close to this? And
yes.
Yeah, so you can see the similarity. Identification of a site where the slave potter Dave worked was a first step. While the University of South Carolina never did launch its own research program, they encouraged the Holcombs to do as much archaeology as they could on their own. USC archaeologist Stanley South first encountered alkaline glaze pottery early in his career. They were.
In the 1960s in North Carolina at Brunswick Town on the Cape Fear River, I was excavating the colonial town of Brunswick, which was burned in 1775. But there were a couple of ruins there that dated up until about 1830. And in those ruins I found this lead glaze looking ware, but that was obviously stoneware. But I knew it couldn't be lead glazed if it was stoneware, because if you heat the ceramics high enough to be stoneware, you drive the lead off of the surface. It bubbles and doesn't act right. So I knew, and so in my catalog at that time I called it lead glaze ? Stoneware. But I knew it was stoneware, but the lead glazing was a puzzle.
South then came to the University of South Carolina, where he met another avocational researcher, Georgiana Greer.
In 1970, Georgiana Greer walked into my office, having heard about the Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology, and she came in to talk with an archaeologist there who might know about historic ceramics, and so that was me at the time. And so she said, "I'm interested in alkaline glazed stoneware, and I'm collecting pieces from South Carolina." And I said, "What is that?" And she said, It's a, I'm sure you've seen it. It has a glossy glaze and it's stoneware." And then I recognized the description. I said, "Oh, yeah, I would love to see that." So she took me out to her station wagon. She had a large number of pots that she had bought from antique dealers and people who had collections of pots for sale. And she showed them. We unwrapped them from the newspapers and stood there at her tailgate of her car and looked at these things. And I said, "This is what I've been finding," and not knowing what it was.
It was Greer's work that enabled South to theorize about when the glaze was introduced into South Carolina.
she really had made a case for alkaline glaze stoneware, Edgefield type stoneware, through, as I said, through the focusing on where it occurred, where it had been made, and she found that it's mainly in the South. So I found in going to conferences and asking archaeologists about it, those in the North knew nothing about it, never had seen it, and so forth. So it's really mainly a Southern phenomenon that began somewhere in South Carolina, or possibly with some influence by Bartlam, Ellis, and Christ.
One indication of how alkaline glaze may have first come to South Carolina came to light during one of my own excavations in the state's Santee Canal. Towards the end of the 18th century, some investors in South Carolina built a 23-mile-long canal, the first true canal in America, between the Santee River and the Cooper River to bring trade into Charleston. It was a big venture, the biggest of its era industrially, but it operated for only 50 years and very soon disappeared. In 1988, I was fortunate enough to discover a portion of the canal near Moncks Corner, South Carolina, where we are today. We found the terminal tide lock of the canal and discovered that the masonry wing walls of the canal were made with brick that was covered with a heavy coating of alkaline glazing. This is the first recorded example of alkaline glaze in South Carolina's archaeological record, the earliest dating to 1796 to 1800 when the canal was built. This may offer us clues as to the way in which alkaline glaze was later introduced into Edgefield County, a few days' travel from here, and on the trade route from the frontier to Charleston in those days. Early research has revealed an intriguing facet to this folk pottery tradition. Many of the wares were made by African American potters who appear to have introduced an element of African culture into the tradition. Face pots appear to have been made by slaves for their own religious purposes. Tony Shanks of Florence, South Carolina, was an early collector of these intriguing face jugs.
That's what made it very interesting to me, was the mystery of these things, and why were they made, and of course we found out that they were certainly made by slave potters for slaves, and they were not carried out on the wagon loads of like the other pottery, the utilitarian ware that they were making at that time. And they were just made for a small number of people, you might say, around the pottery, and they were all slaves. When you look back at all the Edgefield face jugs, and there's a certain consistency about them, they were done in such a fashion as that they were just not slopped together, so to speak. They were some time was spent on them. They were carefully made, and they were certainly made to convey a certain message that was known probably by the slaves.
Not all slave potters were known for face jugs. One man, simply named Dave, is famed for his huge storage jars, and even more remarkable, his handwritten couplets incised upon many of the vessels. No one knows where Dave worked from the early 1800s to the 1870s, but his work has done much to establish the unique nature of stonewares from Edgefield County. At the Edgefield County Historical Society's Old Edgefield Pottery, historian potter Steve Farrell has made a study of Dave's techniques. He now applies them to his own jars.
And these are examples of Miles pottery produced by Dave. Even though Dave seemed to have been trained at Pottersville, by the 1830s he seems to be down in the Horse Creek Valley. A lot of his pieces are fairly large. They're pieces many times that have marks on them. This one right here has a double scratch mark, and the dots here indicate how many gallons the piece held. This is our standard storage jar for lard and meat. Others sometimes bear like the initials LM, like this pot and this one do of Lewis Miles. Some also have dates and names incised on them. But this is about a 5-gallon storage jar by Dave that could have been made out of one piece of clay versus very much larger vessels that were made in a different method. Dave used the technique of piecing to come in, I call it coil throwing, where he made a large bowl to begin with, allowed it to harden for a while, and then added soft clay at the top of it.
Can you show us what you see on this large vessel that tells you?
Yes, in many cases he smoothed the outside of the vessel, but on the inside of the vessel we see some different things. And Dave, at the bottom here we see what looks like coils, but these are basically where his fingers dug in, bringing up the bowl. So these are not coils we see at the bottom. Rather, about halfway through this jar there is a real kind of a swelling to the inside. If you feel beneath it, you can feel where Dave took his thumb and softly, smoothly put this clay into the upper part of the bowl here. This is called luting, like playing the instrument. And then he got control of it and brought it upward. This he repeated several times. We can see subsequent additions of coils, and something like this might have been made, say, up into here as a bowl, and then this has several coils, 4 or 5. They're added at the top of it, and it's let me, trying to duplicate it has let me see things like this right here, and this is where the two ends of the coil came together. And so you have a slight irregularity right here in the coil, or in the lip of the piece, even though he's turned it. Generally he used probably a chip of wood, we call a rib today, and smoothed the outside of it here and let the inside kind of fall where it would. However, there are some Dave pots where you can see very evidently, even on the outside, where he progressed and added. Now this is about a 15-gallon piece by Dave, and he made some almost 3 times his size. They're not much taller, although he did make some fairly tall straight-sided pieces, but they're much wider girth. And this allowed him to build very large gallonage. Also, some of them are signed with 2 names, Dave and Badler, on one in the Charleston Museum, on a very large one, indicating that he had help. Maybe Badler turning the wheel is what it's been suggested. Maybe Badler helping him hold this big coil. When you get a pot like so, and it really takes a very lengthy coil to go all the way around it, and it's soft. So it might have taken 2 people to transport this right to the lip of it. Here, I just kind of arrange it, lute it together here, and by taking and moving this clay right down on the top of the bowl, I start to adhere it. Then I'm going to come on the inside and start and work on the inside of the wall here, doing the same thing. I've got it kind of to the inside here. Gently, we're going to...
The reason you do this is because they wouldn't have supported it at all.
That's right. It would be too affected by gravity and wetness of the clay all in one piece there. You get a kind of a jello-like consistency once you get to a certain point, and then the clay starts to slump. And here I'm applying kind of equal pressure. I'm doing a very slow turning here and bringing up the wall just very, very gradually.
So this is what the finished vessel looks like. Can you explain how you get this final form and how the lug handles are attached?
Yeah, this particular piece I threw a bowl about right to this region, and this is 5 coils that's come from here up into this region. The last one was about this much of a section. I've been pretty cautious on my first ones here. They're a little bit thicker than I really like them to be. But handles are pulled. These would be like a pitcher or a strap handle that's laid on the side, on the shoulder here. Here we have the clay in a stiffened condition. We score and slip the handle and basically apply it like so, and then lute back into here to basically adhere it to the handles and
that's
finish
pretty
off
much the way Dave
like so.
did it too. Right?
That's right.
But
That's
in this
right.
form, you call this a lug handle?
This is a lug handle or an ear handle,
Yeah.
and really this is in the greenware stage right now. This, I in particular employ 2 firings to finish my work, and this will fire slowly to around 1850 degrees. Modern pottery code 06, yeah. And this will basically put it in a condition, kind of a flower pot hardness, and then we'll apply the glaze. Now, in the earlier days, they didn't have any vats really big enough to do this kind of thing, and it would be unwieldy, so most of the glazes like this are poured. And
Poured on.
yeah, there I'll take and put it over a wash tub and turn it upside down on slats and pour the interior first, and then pour the exterior.
And when we look on the top here, we can see the joint of the last curve,
Yes.
coil, pretty much the way we see it exactly on the Dave jug.
Yeah.
Edgefield's historic courthouse is at the centre of an area abundant with historic pottery sites. Many of them are now damaged by looters, and few have been examined by archaeologists. Further study of the area's stoneware traditions continues as a part of a long-range research program by the Georgia Archaeological Institute of Augusta, Georgia. The institute works closely with avocationals, such as Nick Nichols, here beginning an excavation at an entirely new site near Aiken, South Carolina.
These are some of the things we're looking for. The diagnostic pieces that show the way different necks are made, the styling, the way they're connected, the way the handles are connected to the base tells us a lot. You can tell different potterers by the way they consistently connect them. The types of shoulders, of course the glazes. This is one that's been cleaned and processed and numbered already. Finding a spot like this is unique in the fact that we can work this site before pot hunters get a hold of it and completely destroy the site. We can get some great diagnostics out of it. We can tell certain things about certain potters, and we can compare it to known potterers and get an idea of what was going on in the different eras of pot making.
His work with the Institute writes a new chapter in the story of Edgefield County's folk stoneware traditions. Research continues to document the work of the artisan potters who a century ago used clay, water, and fire to create a magnificent folk art tradition, a heritage in clay.